The Mafia boss saw the black maid comfort his night-terror-stricken daughter, and his heart finally cracked open. In a large, lavish estate tucked away in the heart of the city, where marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers, an unexpected moment was unfolding. Sophie Romano, the young daughter of Mafia boss Victor Romano, was tossing and turning in her bed, trapped in the terrifying grip of a night terror. Her small body trembled under the thick blankets, her face scrunched in fear. The room, designed with elegance and opulence, suddenly felt cold and distant as Sophie's cries filled the air. Ella Johnson, the black maid who had worked in the Romano household for several years, heard the familiar sounds of distress. She knew Sophie's night terrors all too well, how they would come and go, leaving the child vulnerable and in need of comfort. Ella, a woman of deep compassion, had always been a steady presence in the mansion, doing her best to keep her head down and perform her duties quietly. But tonight, something was different. Sophie's cries were harder, more desperate. Ella couldn't ignore them. She quickly made her way to the child's room, her heart aching at the sound of her distress. As she entered, Sophie's eyes were wide open, filled with fear, yet unseeing. Ella knelt by the bed, her hand reaching out to gently stroke Sophie's hair. She whispered soothing words, her voice soft and calming, the way she had once comforted her own children in another life. "You're safe, Sophie. It's just a bad dream. You're not alone." Slowly, Sophie's frantic movements began to settle, and her breathing softened. Ella continued to hum a lullaby, a simple song of reassurance that had always worked to ease the fears of the little ones in her care. Outside the room, Victor Romano stood, his strong frame silhouetted by the faint light coming from the hallway. He had heard the commotion from his office, but hadn't moved until now. As he stood there, watching the maid's gentle interaction with his daughter, something inside him stirred. He had never seen Ella like this, so tender, so maternal with Sophie. He was accustomed to the cold, calculated world of power and control, where emotions were weak and easily manipulated. But in this moment, he saw something raw and real. He stepped forward, his boots making a soft thud on the floor. Ella didn't notice him at first, too focused on Sophie, but when she did, she froze. Victor's gaze was fixed on her, and for the first time, it wasn't one of judgment or superiority. He was taken aback by the warmth and tenderness she had shown Sophie. "You should go." Victor's voice was rough, yet there was something softer beneath it. Ella looked up at him, her heart racing, her words barely a whisper. "She was scared, sir. She needed comfort." Victor's gaze softened just a fraction as he stepped further into the room. Sophie's calm was evident, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a weight lifting from his chest. He didn't know what it was about this moment, but it moved him in a way he couldn't explain. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice almost unrecognizable in its sincerity. Ella nodded, not trusting herself to speak, but something inside her softened too. In a household of power and control, it was the smallest act of kindness that had broken through the hard shell that surrounded Victor Romano's heart. Victor stood in the doorway, his heart pounding in a way he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't fear. He had faced countless dangers in his life, but this was something different. Something about the way Ella had looked at Sophie, how she had comforted her with such tenderness, had stirred something deep within him. For a moment, he stood frozen, watching her, as if seeing her for the first time. He had always seen his staff as just that, staff. People to serve him, to maintain the house, to follow orders. But Ella, she was different. The way she had spoken to his daughter, her voice soft and full of care, made him feel something unfamiliar. It was as if, for the first time, he saw her not as just another maid, but as a person who cared deeply for the people she looked after. "You should go now," Victor repeated, his voice still holding a hint of the command he was used to giving. But this time, there was a crack in the usual authority. Ella nodded quietly, her eyes avoiding his. She didn't know what to make of the shift in the atmosphere. This was Victor Romano, cold, calculating, and ruthless. The man who commanded respect from everyone, from his associates to his enemies. Yet, tonight, something had changed. Something about the way he was looking at her made her heart race. She gently pulled the blanket up to Sophie's chin, smoothing it out one last time. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly, almost to herself. I just couldn't let her suffer. Victor watched her, his expression unreadable. There was a long silence before he finally spoke again, his voice softer than before. You did well. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that made Ella's breath catch. She had been in this house for years, serving this man, and never had he spoken to her like this. Never had he shown any sign of appreciation, let alone respect. She swallowed hard, still unsure of what to say. Was he being sincere? Was this a shift in his character, or was it just the moment? Thank you, sir, she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Victor gave a short nod, as if dismissing the conversation, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. You can go now, he said, his voice returning to its usual sharpness. Ella nodded again and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. As she walked down the long, dark hallway, her mind was racing. What had just happened? Victor had always been distant, cold even. His world was one of power, manipulation, and control. But in that moment, when he had seen the kindness in her actions, something had shifted. She had seen it in his eyes, the crack in his armor, the vulnerability he had tried so hard to keep hidden. She didn't know what it meant, but it unsettled her. The world she lived in, the world she served, was one built on hard edges and sharp lines. There was no room for softness, for kindness. But somehow, in this mansion, in this house of stone and cold wealth, she had found a small spark of something different. She had seen it in Victor, too. The way he had stood there, his usual stern demeanor giving way to something softer, something more human. As she reached her small quarters, Ella sat down on the edge of her bed, her thoughts still tangled. She had been working in this house for years, but she had never imagined that a simple act of kindness could cause such a shift. She had only done what felt right in that moment, but now, she wondered if it had changed something between them. The next morning, as the sun filtered through the curtains, Ella prepared for another day of work, but everything felt different. Her usual routine felt heavier now, as if the air had shifted. She passed the grand dining room where Victor was sitting, his back straight, his eyes focused on the papers before him. He didn't look up as she entered, but there was a change in the air, something unspoken between them. Ella didn't know how to navigate this new dynamic. She had always kept her distance, respected the boundaries of her role. But now, she felt an unfamiliar pull, an unspoken tension in the air. As she served breakfast, she caught his gaze for just a moment. This time, it wasn't cold or dismissive. It was different, more understanding, more human. And for the briefest second, she saw a flicker of something deeper, something more than just the powerful Mafia boss she had always known. Victor, too, was aware of the change. He had never been one to dwell on emotions, to allow himself to feel anything that could be perceived as weakness. But last night, something had shifted in him. He had witnessed a side of Ella he had never expected, a side that made him question everything he had built his empire on. For years, he had ruled with an iron fist, never allowing anyone to get close, to see the cracks in his armor. But last night, when he had seen her with his daughter, something had cracked open in his chest. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore it, and he didn't want to. The feeling lingered as he watched her now, serving him breakfast with the same quiet efficiency. But this time, he didn't look at her the way he always had. This time, he saw her, and it made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Human. The days that followed were quieter than usual, but a subtle tension hung in the air between Victor and Ella. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, but it was there, something unspoken, something that shifted their usual dynamic. Ella continued her duties with her usual efficiency, moving through the mansion with the grace of someone who had learned how to be invisible, to blend into the background. Yet, now, every time she passed Victor, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her, not with the cold, dismissive gaze he had always worn, but with something softer, something more human. It unsettled her. She had worked for the Romano family for years, and in that time, she had learned to keep her emotions at bay. But lately, she found herself questioning the boundaries she had always kept. She had seen a side of Victor she had never imagined existed, the tenderness he showed Sophie, his daughter, the way he had watched her comfort the child. It was a glimpse into a world of vulnerability that Ella had never associated with the man who controlled everything around him with ironclad precision. For the first time, She wondered if he was more than just the powerful mafia boss who ruled the city with fear. She wondered if there was more to him than the cold, calculating exterior. One afternoon, as Ella was polishing the silverware in the dining room, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the other servants, but instead, it was Victor. He stood there, just a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied her, as though trying to read her. "Ella," he said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet authority that she had always known. "I need to speak with you." She nodded, her heart fluttering in her chest. She had no idea what this could be about. Was he angry? Was there something she had done wrong? She had always kept her head down, did her work, and never asked questions. What could he want? "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her tone respectful, though she could feel the nervousness creeping into her voice. Victor gestured to the window, where the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light across the room. "I've been thinking," he began, his gaze shifting from her to the view outside, "about what happened the other night, with Sophie." Ella's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to bring it up. The memory of that night, the way she had held Sophie in her arms, soothing her through the terror of the night terror, still lingered in her mind. She had never imagined that Victor would remember it, let alone speak about it. I was just trying to help, sir." She was frightened, Ella said, her voice soft but steady. She didn't know why she felt the need to explain herself, but something about Victor's gaze made her feel like he was waiting for her to say more. Victor's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a shift in the atmosphere, a softness in his expression that Ella had never seen before. "You did more than help," he said, his voice quieter now. "You showed her compassion, something I haven't seen much of in this house." Ella's heart skipped a beat. Was he thanking her? She had never received such praise from him before. In all the years she had worked in this house, she had always been just another employee. But this moment felt different. There was something in his words that made her question everything she had believed about him. Could it be that Victor Romano, the man who had built an empire on fear and ruthlessness, was capable of seeing beyond his own power? Ella didn't know what to say. She had spent so many years keeping her distance, doing her job without drawing attention to herself, that the idea of having a conversation like this with Victor felt almost surreal. "I do what I can, sir," she said after a pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just doing my job." Victor nodded, as though considering her words carefully. "Your job, yes. But you've done something more than that." He took a step closer, and Ella felt a flutter in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She had never been this close to him before, not like this. "You've earned something here, Ella. Something I didn't expect." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that she couldn't quite comprehend. What did he mean by that? Had she earned his respect? Was he finally seeing her as something more than just a maid? "I don't expect you to understand now," he continued, his tone still calm, but there was an underlying intensity to it. "But I need you to know that I appreciate what you did, more than you think." Ella's mind was racing. She didn't know how to respond to this. Victor, the man who had always been distant, detached, had just acknowledged her in a way that made her heart ache. She had never imagined that this moment would come. Never imagined that a simple act of kindness, a moment of vulnerability with a frightened child, could change everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken thoughts, the tension palpable. Finally, Victor turned toward the door, his hand resting on the handle. "You can go now, Ella. We'll speak more later." As she watched him leave, Ella stood there, her heart still racing. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Victor Romano was no longer just the mafia boss. He was something else, something more complex. And for the first time, Ella wasn't sure where she stood in his world, but she knew one thing. Things had changed between them. Days passed, and though the mansion continued to operate as it always had, a subtle shift remained between Victor and Ella. It was unspoken, almost like a tension that neither one of them knew how to address. Ella went about her duties, carrying herself with the same quiet grace she always had, but there was a difference now. Every time Victor crossed her path, there was a moment, just a fleeting second, when their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken words. Victor, on the other hand, found himself caught in a rare state of introspection. He had never allowed anyone to get close to him. Not truly. not even his closest associates. His life had been one of power, control, and calculation. Emotions had no place in the empire he built. Yet, the way Ella had cared for his daughter, Sophie, had stirred something inside him. For the first time in years, he felt a crack in the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself. He had never expected to feel gratitude for someone like her. A maid. Someone who existed in the shadows, far below him in the hierarchy of his world. Yet, the way she had quietly, without hesitation, comforted Sophie, had shown him a side of Ella that made him question everything he had known. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow over the grand estate, Victor sat in his study, papers spread out in front of him. He was supposed to be working, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the same thing, Ella. She had been in his life for so long, but never had he truly noticed her. Not like this. His mind wandered back to the moment he had witnessed her with Sophie. The way her hands had gently stroked Sophie's hair, the way her voice had calmed his daughter's frantic sobs. It had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Just a week ago, he had seen Ella as nothing more than an employee. Now, she had become something more. Something important. He couldn't deny it. He had to see her again. Victor stood up, pushing his chair back with a soft creak. He moved toward the door and opened it, stepping into the hallway. He could hear Ella's quiet footsteps in the distance, her soft humming as she worked. There was something almost peaceful about the sound. As he approached her, she didn't see him at first. Her attention focused on the task at hand. When she finally noticed him, she straightened up quickly, her hands instinctively moving to smooth out her uniform. "Sir," she said, her voice steady but laced with the same nervous energy he had come to expect. "I need to speak with you," he said, his tone surprisingly soft, devoid of the usual authority. Ella nodded and followed him to the sitting room. She didn't know what to expect, but the curiosity gnawed at her. When they reached the room, Victor motioned for her to sit. She hesitated for a moment before complying, taking a seat across from him. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Victor's eyes studied her in a way they never had before. He wasn't sure how to articulate what he was feeling. "You've been here for years, Ella," he began, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I've never asked much of you, other than the work you've done for me. But I need to ask you something now." Ella looked up at him, surprised by the shift in his tone. "Yes, sir," she replied, trying to maintain her composure, though her heart was racing. Victor leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "You've earned something here. I don't know how to explain it, but you've done something for Sophie. Something I didn't expect." Ella's breath caught in her throat. This was not the Victor she knew. The man who had always been distant, cold, and calculating was now speaking to her as if she had done something truly significant. She had always kept her head down, done her job, and never expected anything in return. But this moment felt different. This was something she had never imagined. "I just did what felt right, sir." She was scared. She needed someone. Victor's gaze softened, and for the first time, Ella saw a flicker of something in his eyes that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper. "I know," he said quietly, "but it's more than that. I don't know what it is, but you've changed something here. In me." Ella swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just doing my job," she said softly. "But it means more than that to me," Victor replied. "You've shown me something I didn't expect. I want to thank you. I want you to know that you're valued here." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ella didn't know what to say. She had always respected him, feared him even, but now, she saw him in a new light. The man who had once been a symbol of power and intimidation was now speaking to her as an equal. And for the first time, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was a person, seen and acknowledged by the very man who had once ignored her existence. "I don't know what to say," Ella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything," Victor said with a small smile. "Just know that things are different now. For both of us." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was filled with understanding. Ella nodded slowly, her thoughts swirling in her head. She had spent so long in the background, hiding from the world, never expecting to be seen. But now, in this moment, everything had changed. She wasn't sure where this newfound connection would lead, but she knew one thing for sure. Victor Romano had seen her, and for the first time, she had been truly seen. Days went by, and though the mansion seemed to return to its normal rhythm, a change lingered in the air. Victor found himself drawn into the quiet moments he shared with Ella, those fleeting exchanges when their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. He had always kept his distance, maintaining his role as the boss, the powerful figure who demanded respect. But now, every time Ella crossed his path, there was a strange pull, a connection that he could no longer ignore. He had always prided himself on his control, but now he felt it slipping in ways he didn't understand. One evening, as he sat in his office, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him, he found himself thinking of her again. Ella, the maid. It didn't make sense. He had never allowed himself to be distracted by someone like her. She was just an employee, a small part of the vast network that kept his world running. And yet, the more he thought about her, the more he realized how much she had changed his perception. It was her kindness that had broken through his hardened exterior. The way she had cared for Sophie, the way she had quietly comforted his daughter during the night terror. Something in him had shifted that night. He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to explain it. But it had been the catalyst for something he hadn't anticipated. And now, every time he saw her, it was as though he was seeing her for the first time. He wasn't sure if that terrified him or intrigued him more. He was sitting alone, his mind racing with these thoughts, when the door to his office creaked open. Ella stepped in, her usual calm demeanor in place. But today, there was a difference in her eyes, a quiet hesitation that hadn't been there before. "Sir?" she asked, her voice steady, though he could hear the slight tremor beneath it. Victor looked up, his gaze locking with hers. There was something unspoken between them now, something they both knew but hadn't acknowledged. He motioned for her to come closer. "Ella, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low. She hesitated for a moment, then walked toward his desk, standing a few feet away, waiting for him to speak. For a long moment, Victor just looked at her, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. It was as if he was searching for the right words, words he had never had to find before. "You've been here for a long time," he finally said, his voice softer than usual. "I've never asked much of you, just the usual work. But I can't ignore what's happened." Ella's heart raced, but she kept her composure. She had no idea where this conversation was going, but she could feel the weight of it in the air. "I don't know what you mean, sir," she replied, her voice steady, though inside, she was nervous. Victor leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "What happened with Sophie," he began, "was more than just comforting her. It was more than just doing your job. You did something for her that I didn't expect." Ella's breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined Victor would acknowledge what had happened that night. She had done what anyone would have done in her place, but she knew that Victor wasn't one to give praise easily. "I just helped her, sir." She was scared, Ella said softly, unsure of what else to say. Victor nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "I know you were just doing your job," he said, "but it was more than that. It's the way you did it, the way you were there for her." He paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I've spent my life building this empire, making sure that nothing can touch me, that no one can get too close. But you've done something that I haven't allowed anyone to do in years." Ella felt her heart pounding in her chest. What was he saying? Was he admitting something? She stood silently, waiting for him to continue. "I've been thinking about it," Victor continued, his voice quieter now, "about how you've been here all these years. And I've never really seen you." He paused again, his eyes meeting hers, and this time, there was a softness in them that made Ella's breath catch. "But now I see you, Ella. I see what you've done, and I can't ignore it anymore." The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the weight of his words. Ella didn't know what to say. She had always respected him, but now, as he spoke to her in this way, she wasn't sure if she should be honored or confused. Victor's expression remained steady, but there was a flicker of something deeper than the usual control he had over everything. "I don't know what this means, or where it will lead," Victor said. "But I need you to know that you've changed things here. You've changed something in me." Ella's heart was racing. She had never imagined this moment, never expected to hear such words from him. The powerful, unyielding Mafia boss was speaking to her, as if she were someone who mattered. I don't know what to say, sir," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor gave her a small smile, a rare thing that made his features seem softer. "You don't need to say anything," he replied. Just know that things are different now. For both of us. As he stood, preparing to leave the room, he glanced back at her one last time. Thank you, Ella. For everything. Ella watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him. She stood there for a moment, her mind racing. She had never expected this shift in their relationship, never imagined that a single act of kindness could change everything. But now, as she stood in the silence of the room, she realized that something had indeed changed. And she wasn't sure what that meant for her or for Victor, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The following days were filled with a strange quiet that neither Victor nor Ella could quite explain. The tension between them had shifted into something new, something fragile. Victor found himself reflecting on their last conversation, on the vulnerability he had shown and the unexpected feeling of being seen, something he had never allowed himself to experience. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing, not just in his household, but in himself. Every time he passed Ella, he felt a pull, a connection that was impossible to ignore. She was still the same quiet, efficient maid she had always been, but now there was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of something more. As the days went on, Victor began to find himself seeking her out more often, not for work, but for something else. It was subtle at first. He would find himself looking for her in the halls, noticing when she was nearby, even if it was just for a brief moment. He wasn't sure what it was, but there was something about her presence that brought a sense of calm he hadn't realized he was missing. For Ella, the change in their dynamic was just as jarring. She had always kept her distance from Victor, her role as an employee keeping them worlds apart. But now, she found herself unsure of how to navigate the space between them. There were moments when he would look at her, and for a brief second, she saw a softness in his eyes that she had never noticed before. It made her uncomfortable, in a way she couldn't explain. She had spent so many years working for him, understanding her place in his world, that the idea of him seeing her as something more than just a maid felt foreign. Yet, something in her heart told her that the boundaries she had once kept so carefully were beginning to blur. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light across the mansion, Victor found himself standing at the window of his office, looking out over the estate. His thoughts were a tangled mess, his mind drifting to Ella once more. He had never been one for sentimentality, but lately, he couldn't help but wonder what had changed. Why did he feel this pull toward her? Why did he feel so unsettled when she was near? The questions gnawed at him, and he couldn't ignore them any longer. He needed answers. He needed to understand this feeling that had taken root inside him. Without thinking, he walked out of his office and down the hall. He wasn't sure where he was going, only that he needed to see her. As he reached the servants' quarters, he hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure what he would say, but something urged him forward. When he knocked on Ella's door, he was met with a brief silence before she opened it, her expression polite but guarded. "Sir?" she asked, her voice steady. Victor felt his heart race for a moment, as he searched for the right words. He had never felt this nervous around her before, but now, standing in front of her, everything seemed different. "Ella," he began, his voice soft, "I need to talk to you." She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The room was small but neatly kept, a stark contrast to the lavishness of the rest of the mansion. Ella sat on the edge of her bed, her posture straight, waiting for him to speak. Victor paced for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back. "I've been thinking about everything lately," he said, his voice quiet. "About you. About what you did for Sophie." Ella's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she couldn't ignore the tension in the air. "You've been here for a long time," Victor continued, "and I've never truly taken the time to acknowledge you, to really see you." Ella didn't know how to respond. She had always kept her distance, doing her job, never asking for anything in return. But now, hearing these words from him, she felt a strange mix of emotions, surprise, confusion, even a little fear. "I don't know what to say, sir," she replied softly. "You don't have to say anything," Victor said, his voice still low but steady. "I just want you to understand that what you did, it meant something to me. More than you know." There was a long pause, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Ella couldn't understand why this conversation felt so important, so heavy. She had spent her whole life keeping to herself, avoiding anything that might make her vulnerable. But now, standing here with Victor, She felt a shift, a change in the air. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it would change everything. Victor took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Ella, you've done something for me that no one else has. And I want you to know that I appreciate it. Ella felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never expected this kind of acknowledgement from him. He had always been distant, unapproachable, and yet now, he was standing here, speaking to her as though she mattered. She wasn't sure how to process it. She had always thought of herself as just another employee in his world, but now, she wasn't so sure. I don't know what this means, Victor said, his voice softer now. But I want you to know that I won't forget what you did. You've earned something here. Something real. Ella nodded, though her mind was racing. She didn't know what Victor was offering, or what he expected from her, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life in this mansion would never be the same. As Victor turned to leave, he stopped at the door and glanced back at her. Thank you, Ella, he said quietly. And with that, he left the room, leaving Ella standing there, her heart still racing, her mind swirling with questions. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt seen. And she wasn't sure whether to be grateful or terrified. The days that followed felt like they moved in slow motion for both Victor and Ella. Victor found himself spending more time in his office, but his thoughts were never on business anymore. Every time he tried to focus on the mountains of paperwork that demanded his attention, his mind wandered back to that moment with Ella. Her calm demeanor, the way she had comforted Sophie, the vulnerability he had seen in her eyes. It was as though she had seen through the walls he had spent his life building around himself, and in doing so, she had cracked something open within him. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't forget the way he felt when he looked at her. He had always prided himself on his control, on his ability to remain detached from everything. But now, he found himself thinking about her, wanting to be near her, wanting to understand her in a way he had never wanted anything before. Meanwhile, Ella, too, was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. She had always kept her distance from Victor, knowing her place in his world. But now, things felt different. She had always thought of him as untouchable, a figure of power who controlled everything in his orbit. But after their conversation, after the way he had looked at her, something inside her had shifted. She no longer saw him as just the Mafia boss. There was more to him than that. Something vulnerable, something human. She didn't know how to handle these new feelings. Every time she saw him, there was a strange mix of admiration and uncertainty. She had spent so many years trying to stay invisible, trying not to make waves, but now, it felt like the rules had changed. She wasn't sure where she fit in this new dynamic, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. One evening, as she worked quietly in the kitchen, Ella heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. She had become attuned to Victor's presence in the house, the way he moved through it with a quiet authority. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was enough to command attention. As he entered the kitchen, Ella turned toward him, her heart skipping a beat. She couldn't help but notice the way his gaze lingered on her. It wasn't the usual cold, calculating look she had grown accustomed to. There was something softer in his eyes now, something that made her feel exposed in a way she wasn't used to. Ella, he said, his voice steady but with a hint of something else, something unfamiliar. Can we talk? Ella nodded, her mind racing. What did he want to talk about now? Had she done something wrong? She had been careful to maintain her distance, to stay in her lane, but the last few days had left her feeling like she was walking a fine line. She followed him to the sitting room, where the atmosphere was quiet and intimate, the soft glow of the fireplace casting shadows on the walls. Victor gestured for her to sit, and she did so, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was a long silence as he stood by the window, looking out over the estate. Ella waited, unsure of what was coming. Finally, Victor turned to face her, his expression serious. I've been thinking, he began, his voice lower than usual. About everything. About you. Ella's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her composure. She couldn't understand why he was suddenly so focused on her. She had always kept her distance, performed her duties, and never asked for anything. Sir, I don't know what to say, she said quietly. Victor smiled slightly, almost as if he could read her thoughts. You don't have to say anything. I just want you to understand that things have changed. I've changed. Ella's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what he meant by that. but the weight of his words hit her with a force she hadn't expected. She had always known Victor as a man of control, a man who never let his emotions show. But now, he was admitting to something that made her feel as though the ground beneath her feet was shifting. I don't know how to explain it, Victor continued, but what happened between us, with Sophie, it made me see things differently. It made me see you differently. Ella felt a strange mix of emotions wash over her. She didn't know how to process his words, but she couldn't deny the way her heart was racing. Was he thanking her? Was he acknowledging something that had been unspoken for so long? I didn't expect this, Victor said, his voice quieter now. But I owe you an apology. For not seeing you. For not acknowledging your worth. Ella felt her chest tighten at his words. She had spent so many years serving in the background, doing what was expected of her without ever asking for recognition. But now, in this moment, Victor was offering something she had never imagined. He was offering her something more than just a job. He was offering her respect. I didn't ask for this, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I see you, Victor replied, his gaze steady and unwavering. And I want you to know that your place here, with me, is different now. You've earned that. Ella sat there in silence, unsure of how to respond. She had always feared the power Victor held over her, but now, she was beginning to realize that the power had shifted. The walls between them had come down, and for the first time, she felt like she wasn't just an invisible servant in his world. She was something more. The silence stretched between them, but it was no longer uncomfortable. There was an understanding now, a mutual recognition of the changes that had taken place. And though Ella didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for sure. Victor's acknowledgement had shifted something deep within her, and she wasn't sure where it would lead, but she was ready to find out. The weeks that followed felt both strange and familiar to Ella. Every day, she continued her duties, maintaining the same quiet grace she had always carried. But there was an undeniable shift in the air. Victor had changed the dynamics of their relationship, and though they didn't speak about it, they both felt it. This new understanding between them. It wasn't just the subtle exchanges of glances or the softening in Victor's tone when he spoke to her. It was something deeper, something she hadn't anticipated. She had spent years keeping to herself, hiding her true feelings, her true self, behind the walls she had built. But now, every time Victor looked at her, she felt as though the walls were slowly crumbling. He no longer treated her as just an employee. There was a new respect between them, a recognition that hadn't existed before. It left her feeling vulnerable, unsure of how to handle it. She had always respected Victor's authority, his power, but now, seeing him as someone who could be vulnerable, who could show kindness, made her question everything she had known about him. And yet, she couldn't deny that something inside her was drawn to him. Victor, on the other hand, was grappling with feelings he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. The way Ella had cared for Sophie, the way she had quietly calmed his daughter's night terrors, had left an indelible mark on him. It wasn't just that she had done something good. It was how she had done it, without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. It had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent his entire life building an empire on control and power, never allowing anyone to get close, never allowing himself to feel anything that could be perceived as weakness. But Ella had changed that. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way she had looked at him when she had spoken to him, the vulnerability in her eyes, the way she had cared for his family. It was something he had never allowed himself to experience, and yet now it felt like a part of him that had been buried for years was slowly awakening. One evening, Victor found himself standing in the study, staring out the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the estate. He could hear the soft rustle of the trees outside, the distant hum of the mansion. But his mind was elsewhere. It was on Ella, on the way her presence had begun to affect him in ways he couldn't explain. He had never been one to entertain emotions, to allow anyone to get under his skin. But she had done it, in ways he couldn't even understand. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard a soft knock on the door. Without turning, he called out, "Enter." The door opened, and Ella stepped into the room. Her presence always seemed to fill the space, not with words, but with something else, something intangible. She was standing there now, looking at him with the same quiet composure she always had. But this time, He could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "You wanted to see me, sir?" she asked, her voice steady, though there was a hint of apprehension beneath it. Victor turned to face her, his gaze softening slightly. "Ella," he said, his voice lower than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation. About what I said." Ella nodded, unsure of where this was going. She had heard the change in his voice, the sincerity behind his words. But she still couldn't fully understand why he was speaking to her like this. "And what have you been thinking about?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Victor's gaze held hers for a moment before he spoke again. "I've been thinking about how you've been here all this time, and how you've never asked for anything. You've just done your job. But now, I see you. I see the person you are." The words hit Ella like a wave. She had never imagined Victor would speak to her like this. She had always kept her distance, believing that she was nothing more than a servant in his world. But now, hearing these words, she felt like she was being seen for the first time. She didn't know how to respond. Was he truly acknowledging her? Did he understand what he was saying? "I don't know what to say," Ella said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't need to say anything," Victor replied, his voice calm. But there was an intensity behind it that she couldn't ignore. "Just know that I'm not the same man I was before. And it's because of you." Ella's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't understand what he meant by that, but she knew that his words had changed something in her. Something deep inside her that she hadn't known was there. I don't know what this means," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "but thank you." Victor nodded, his expression softening further. "You've done something for me that I can't ignore. And for that, I'll never forget it." There was a long silence between them, a quiet understanding that neither of them had expected, but it was there, hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. Ella didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't just another shadow in the mansion. She was someone who had made an impact, someone who had changed the course of things. And as she looked at Victor, she realized that for the first time, she was truly seen. As the days passed, Victor and Ella found themselves navigating the strange new dynamic between them. It was subtle at first, an unspoken understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of what had changed. They were still the same people, playing the same roles, but something had shifted. Victor, once distant and controlling, found himself drawn to Ella in ways he couldn't explain. He had never allowed himself to be vulnerable, never allowed anyone to get close. But now, with Ella, everything felt different. Every time their paths crossed, there was a lingering tension, an unspoken connection that neither of them knew how to handle. For Ella, it was just as confusing. She had spent so many years staying out of the spotlight, keeping her distance from Victor and everyone else in the mansion. She had been invisible in his world, just another face in the background, doing her job without ever expecting recognition. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer invisible. Victor had seen her. He had acknowledged her. And that had changed everything. She wasn't sure if she should be grateful or afraid. She had never imagined that something so small, something as simple as comforting Sophie, could make such an impact on the man who ruled the entire estate. But now, she couldn't ignore the way he looked at her, the way his presence lingered in the room when he was near her. It unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. One evening, after the dinner rush had ended and the mansion had quieted down, Victor found himself walking the halls, unable to focus on the stack of papers that awaited his attention. His mind kept drifting back to Ella. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this way about anyone. He had always been in control, always had a plan, but with Ella, it was different. There was no plan, no control, just a strange, magnetic pull that he couldn't ignore. He couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. And as he turned the corner, he saw her, Ella, standing by the window in the quiet hallway, looking out at the night sky. She didn't hear him approach, and for a moment, Victor just watched her, wondering what she was thinking. What did she feel? He didn't know, but he felt an overwhelming urge to speak to her, to say something that would finally break the silence between them. He stepped forward, his footsteps soft on the marble floor, and when she turned, their eyes met. Ella's expression was calm, but Victor could see the flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. It was the same look he had seen in his own reflection countless times, the hesitation that came with letting someone in, with allowing yourself to feel something you had always kept buried. "Ella," he said, his voice low, I need to talk to you." She nodded, as if she had been expecting this moment. She followed him into the sitting room, and they both sat across from each other, the space between them filled with unspoken words. Victor took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had never been good with words, especially when it came to matters of the heart. But he knew he had to speak, had to break the silence that had been growing between them. "I've been thinking about everything," he began, his voice steady but with a hint of vulnerability. "About what happened. About you." Ella looked at him, her eyes calm, but there was a trace of uncertainty in her expression. "Sir, I don't know what you mean," she said softly. Victor looked at her, his gaze softening. He had never expected this moment, never expected to feel this way about someone who had always been so far below him in the world he had built. But now he couldn't deny it. She had changed something in him, something he had kept locked away for so long. "What happened with Sophie," he said slowly, "was more than just a moment of kindness. It was something else." Ella's heart skipped a beat. Was he acknowledging what had happened? Was he recognizing what she had done for Sophie? She didn't know what to say. She had never expected to have this conversation with him, never imagined that Victor, the man who had always seemed so distant, so untouchable, would look at her this way. "I've spent my life building this empire," Victor continued, "but I've always done it alone. I've never let anyone in, not really. But you've made me see things differently." Ella felt a lump form in her throat, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She had always kept her emotions in check, always focused on the job, never allowing herself to get too close to anyone. But now, in this moment, with Victor speaking to her like this, everything felt different. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Victor replied softly. "I just need you to understand that I see you, Ella. I see who you are. And I want you to know that you're more than just someone who works here." Ella's breath caught in her chest. She had never imagined this. She had always thought of herself as nothing more than a servant in his world, someone who was invisible, someone who would never be seen for anything other than what she was paid to do. But now, Victor was telling her that she mattered. He was telling her that she was more than just a maid. "You've earned something here," Victor said, his voice steady. "Something real." Ella nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say, but she knew that this moment would change everything. She wasn't just another face in the crowd anymore. She was someone who mattered. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe it. The days following their conversation were different for both Victor and Ella. Though they continued their daily routines, the subtle changes between them grew more evident with each passing day. Victor no longer simply acknowledged Ella's presence. He noticed her. He saw the way she moved through the mansion, the care she put into every task, and the quiet strength in her demeanor. For the first time, he didn't just see her as part of the background, someone who existed solely to fulfill her duties. No, now he saw a woman, someone who had earned his respect, someone who had become an integral part of his world. Ella, on the other hand, found herself caught in the emotional turmoil of their newfound understanding. She had always kept her distance from Victor, keeping to herself and never allowing herself to get too involved in the lives of the family she worked for. But now, the walls she had built around herself were slowly crumbling. Victor's words had shaken her. She wasn't sure what this meant for them or where it would lead, but one thing was clear: things were changing. She no longer felt like just an invisible employee. For the first time, she felt seen, truly seen, by the man who had once seemed so distant and untouchable. One afternoon, as Victor walked through the mansion, his mind was preoccupied with thoughts of Ella. He found himself seeking her out more often, looking for reasons to cross paths with her. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't ignore the pull he felt when she was nearby. The last few weeks had been an unspoken dance, each of them navigating the delicate tension between them. Victor had always been a man of control, of calculated decisions, but with Ella, everything felt different. It felt like he was letting go of the reins just a little bit, and that terrified him. Yet, he couldn't help but want more of whatever this was. He reached the kitchen, where Ella was busy preparing the evening meal. She was focused, her hands moving gracefully as she chopped vegetables, her movements precise and deliberate. When she noticed him standing in the doorway, she paused, her eyes meeting his. There was a moment of silence between them, the air thick with unspoken words. "Ella," Victor said, his voice soft but steady, "can we talk?" Ella nodded, though she was uncertain of what this conversation would be about. She set down the knife and wiped her hands on her apron as she walked toward him. "Of course, sir," she replied. Victor motioned for her to sit at the small table in the corner of the kitchen, a space they both knew well, but had never used for anything but small, mundane conversations. This time, it felt different. The tension in the air was palpable. As Ella sat, Victor joined her, his hands folded in front of him. He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I've been thinking," he began, "about how things have changed between us." Ella felt her heart race. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she had a feeling that this conversation would change everything. "I didn't expect this," Victor continued, his voice low and thoughtful. "I didn't expect to feel the way I do." Ella swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She had no idea what he was talking about, but she could feel her chest tightening with anticipation. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor hesitated before answering. "I mean that I've spent my life keeping people at a distance," he said, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I've built walls around myself, around my family, and I've never let anyone in. But you've made me see things differently." Ella felt a rush of emotions, surprise, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite name. She had always known Victor as a man of power, someone who commanded respect through fear and control. She had never imagined he could be vulnerable, could feel anything other than the need to dominate his world. "I didn't want to feel this," Victor continued, his voice almost regretful. "But I can't deny it anymore. You've changed something in me, Ella." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, thick and heavy, and Ella wasn't sure how to process them. She had always respected him, feared him even, but now, as he sat before her, speaking with such raw honesty, she saw him in a new light. She saw the man behind the power, the vulnerability he had kept hidden for so long. "I never expected to be seen this way," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I've always kept my distance, never letting anyone in. But now," she hesitated, unsure of what to say next. Victor nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm sorry for the way I've treated you in the past. I've been blind to the people around me, and you've shown me something I never thought I'd see." Ella looked at him, unsure of how to respond. She had spent so long hiding from him, from everyone, that the idea of opening herself up to him felt like a risk. But in this moment, she realized that Victor wasn't the man she had once thought him to be. He wasn't just the Mafia boss. He was something more, something human. "You've earned something here, Ella," Victor said, his voice steady. "Something that goes beyond your role in this house. I want you to know that." Ella's heart swelled at his words. She had never expected this kind of recognition, this kind of acknowledgement. She had always been just a maid, just another employee in the background. But now, she was being seen. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she was more than what she had always thought she was. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Victor stood up, his expression softening as he looked at her. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Just know that I see you. And I respect you." Ella nodded, her heart still racing. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew that nothing would ever be the same between them again. The walls had come down, and in that space, something new had begun to grow, something neither of them had expected. The days following their conversation were filled with a strange tension, but neither Victor nor Ella acknowledged it directly. Their interactions remained polite, cordial, and functional, but there was an unspoken shift between them. The walls that had once defined their relationship as employer and employee now felt less solid, as if they had both stepped into a new, unfamiliar space. Victor found himself thinking about Ella more than he wanted to admit. Her quiet strength, the way she moved through the mansion with such grace, her unwavering commitment to the people around her. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was seeing her in a completely new light. He had always thought of his world in terms of control, power, and dominance, but with Ella, everything seemed different. He didn't have control over her, nor did he want it. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, but also one that made him question what he had always believed about himself. One evening, as he walked through the grand hallways of the mansion, Victor found himself looking for Ella. He didn't know why. It wasn't as if he needed something specific from her. He just wanted to see her, to know she was there. He had always prided himself on being the one who dictated the terms of everything. But with Ella, it was as though the roles had reversed. He couldn't quite explain it. As he turned the corner, he saw her standing in the distance, her back to him as she moved toward the kitchen. There was something peaceful about the way she carried herself, an ease in her movements that he admired. Without thinking, he called out to her. "Ella," he said, his voice carrying down the hallway. She turned at the sound of his voice, her face softening as she saw him approach. There was no hesitation in her movement, no anxiety or nervousness, just a calm acknowledgement that she was, once again, seen. "Sir," she said, her voice steady and composed, but he noticed the slight pause in her expression. "I need to talk to you," Victor said, his voice quieter than usual. Ella nodded and walked toward him, as if she knew exactly what this moment was. She had no idea what he was going to say, but she understood that it was important. They made their way to the library, a room Victor often retreated to when he wanted to think. He motioned for her to sit, and she did so with grace, taking a seat across from him. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow across the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, but it was also filled with an unspoken understanding. Finally, Victor spoke, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've been thinking," he began, "about how everything has changed between us." Ella's heart raced. She hadn't expected him to bring it up so directly. She had been wondering about it too, the shift that had occurred between them, the way they both seemed to be navigating this strange new dynamic. She had always kept her distance, focused solely on her duties, but now, with every glance they exchanged, she felt herself letting go of the walls she had built around her. "I don't know what to say," Ella replied, her voice soft but steady. She wasn't sure if she should feel nervous, or if this conversation was something she had been waiting for. "You don't need to say anything," Victor said, his tone surprisingly gentle. "I just need you to know that I see you. I see who you are." Ella blinked, taken aback by his words. She had spent so much of her life in the background, unseen and unnoticed, that hearing him say this felt almost surreal. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly, unable to hide the uncertainty in her voice. Victor took a deep breath, his expression softening. "I've spent my life building walls," he said, his voice low. "I've always kept everyone at a distance. But with you, I feel like I'm seeing something real, something I never allowed myself to see before." Ella's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to be so open, so vulnerable. She had always seen him as the powerful, untouchable Mafia boss, the man who commanded respect through fear. But now, she was seeing a different side of him, a man who was capable of feeling, of acknowledging his own vulnerabilities. "I don't know how to explain it," Victor continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you've done something for me, Ella. Something that's made me realize that I've been missing something all these years." Ella didn't know what to say. She had always kept her emotions in check, never allowing herself to get too close to anyone. But now, in this moment, she felt the walls she had built around herself beginning to crack. She had spent so many years protecting herself, never letting anyone in. But now, with Victor's words, she felt a warmth in her chest that she couldn't explain. "You've shown me something," Victor said softly, "and I want you to know that you've earned my respect. You've earned something here that goes beyond your role." Ella's heart fluttered at his words. Respect. That was something she had never expected to receive from him. She had always known her place in his world, and it was never one that held any real value. But now, it seemed that something had changed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to thank me," Victor replied, his gaze steady. "I just wanted you to know that things are different now. I see you, Ella, and that matters more than you know." As the words settled between them, Ella felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had always been afraid that she was nothing more than an invisible part of his world. But now, for the first time, she understood that she mattered to him. And that knowledge, that recognition, was enough to make her believe that perhaps, just perhaps, her place in this world was worth more than she had ever imagined. The days that followed were filled with a new sense of awareness. For Victor, the realization that things had changed between him and Ella weighed heavily on his mind. Every day, he found himself seeking her out, not for business matters, but because he wanted to be near her. It wasn't something he had planned, nor something he had anticipated. He had always been a man of control, a man who dictated the terms of his world. But now he found himself in a position where he wasn't sure what the next step was. Ella, on the other hand, had begun to feel the shift as well. She had always been in the background, unseen by everyone around her. But now, after the conversation with Victor, she felt as though her presence in the mansion was acknowledged in ways it had never been before. The respect he had shown her, even in the quiet moments, made her question everything she had believed about herself. She had spent so many years hiding behind walls, both literal and emotional, but now, she felt as though she was slowly letting them fall. One evening, after dinner had been served and the mansion had settled into its usual quiet, Victor found himself walking the halls again, though this time, there was a purpose to his steps. He had been thinking about Ella all day, about the words they had exchanged, about the changes that had taken place between them. His mind had never been so clouded, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had come to depend on her quiet presence. As he walked, he found himself approaching the door to her quarters. He stopped for a moment, his hand hovering over the door handle. He had never imagined that he would be standing here, at this moment, wanting to talk to her. He had always kept his distance, always made sure there was a clear boundary between him and those who worked for him. But with Ella, the lines had blurred. He couldn't explain it. He just knew that he had to see her again. With a soft exhale, he knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway. "Ella," he called out, his voice soft but firm. Ella's heart skipped a beat when she heard his voice. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she had a feeling that this conversation would be different from the others. She rose from her chair and made her way to the door, opening it to find Victor standing there, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something in the air between them, a silent tension that neither could ignore. "Can I come in?" Victor asked, his voice quiet but gentle. Ella stepped aside, wordlessly allowing him to enter. She wasn't sure what he wanted, but the look on his face told her that this wasn't just about business. She closed the door behind him, her heart racing in her chest. Victor stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the room. It was small, simple, but there was something about it that felt different from the grand rooms in the rest of the mansion. It felt more personal, more real. "Ella," Victor began, his voice steady but with a hint of something vulnerable beneath it. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about the other day." Ella nodded, her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what he was going to say, but she knew it was important. She had spent so much time trying to figure out what this all meant, what his words meant, but she couldn't find the answers on her own. She needed to hear it from him. "And?" she asked softly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Victor turned to face her, his gaze softer than usual. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to read her, trying to understand the quiet strength that had drawn him to her. "I don't want to make this complicated," he said, his voice low, "but I need you to understand that things have changed for me. I can't look at you the same way anymore. Not after everything that's happened." Ella's heart fluttered in her chest. She hadn't realized how much she had wanted to hear him say this, how much she had hoped that he would see her for who she truly was, and not just as someone who worked for him. "I've always been a man who controlled everything around me," Victor continued, his tone reflective. "But with you, I feel different. I feel like I'm letting go of something I've held on to for so long. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's happening." Ella didn't know how to respond. The words Victor had spoken were both a revelation and a challenge. She had spent so long trying to keep her distance, trying to maintain a level of professionalism in her work, but now, that line had been crossed. "I never wanted this," Victor said, his voice softer now, almost apologetic. "But I can't deny it anymore. I can't keep pretending that nothing has changed." Ella looked at him, her mind racing. She had always kept herself guarded, always maintained a safe distance from everyone around her. But now, for the first time, she felt something shifting deep within her. She didn't know if it was fear or excitement, but she knew that whatever this was, it was real. "What are you saying?" Ella asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor stepped closer, his presence enveloping the space between them. "I'm saying that I see you, Ella," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I see you for who you are, and that matters." The words hung in the air, charged with emotion, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, facing each other, the weight of their shared understanding filling the space between them. Finally, Ella spoke, her voice trembling but steady. "I don't know what to say," she said softly. "I never thought I'd hear those words from you." Victor nodded, his gaze softening. "I know," he said, "but I want you to understand that I'm not the same man I was before. I've changed. Because of you." Ella felt a surge of emotion rush through her. She didn't know what this meant for her, for them, but she knew one thing. It was the beginning of something new. Something she wasn't sure she was ready for, but something that she knew she couldn't ignore. The following days felt like a delicate balance between familiarity and uncertainty for both Victor and Ella. While their interactions remained mostly the same, there was a new layer between them, a subtle shift that neither of them fully understood but both felt deeply. Victor had always been a man who relied on control, on knowing exactly what was happening at every moment, but with Ella, it was different. He wasn't sure when it had started, but over the past weeks, he found himself seeking her out more often, not because of any particular need, but simply because he enjoyed being in her presence. Ella, too, found herself struggling to make sense of the changes. She had always kept her emotions guarded, her role clear in the grand scheme of the Romano family's empire. She had been invisible, just another face in the house, another worker doing her job without ever expecting more. But now, after their conversations, after the soft words Victor had spoken to her, everything felt different. She was no longer just someone who worked for him. She was something more, something that Victor had made her see. As days passed, Victor couldn't help but reflect on what had transpired between them. He had always kept his distance from those around him. It had been necessary for his survival in the world he had created. But Ella had slowly become a part of his world in a way he couldn't ignore. Her quiet strength, the way she carried herself with such dignity, had made him see her as more than just an employee. She had earned his respect, but more than that, she had made him reconsider everything he had believed about himself. She had changed him, and that thought made him both uneasy and strangely at peace. One evening, as the sun set over the estate, casting long shadows across the sprawling grounds, Victor found himself standing by the window in his study, lost in thought. His mind kept returning to Ella. He couldn't help it. He had tried to focus on his work, to bury his feelings, but every time he did, his thoughts drifted back to her. Her kindness, her strength, her unwavering commitment to those she cared about. He hadn't expected it to affect him the way it had. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew he couldn't keep ignoring it. He needed to speak to her again. He needed to understand what was happening between them. He couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. As he walked down the hall, he found himself walking toward the kitchen. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't hungry, and he had no need for anything. He just wanted to be near her. When he entered, he found Ella alone, quietly preparing the evening meal. The scent of fresh herbs and roasted vegetables filled the room, and for a brief moment, he was lost in the simplicity of it. Oh, Ella looked up when she heard his footsteps, and for a moment, they simply stood there, looking at each other. There was no need for words. The silence between them was comfortable, but also charged with a new understanding. Finally, Victor spoke, his voice soft, but steady. "Ella," he said, "I've been thinking." Ella turned to face him fully, her heart beating faster as she waited for him to continue. She had no idea what he was about to say, but she knew it was important. "About us," Victor said, his voice lower now. "About everything that's changed." Ella nodded slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She had been wondering when he would address it, when the change between them would finally be spoken aloud. "I've never been one to talk about feelings," Victor continued, his tone quieter than usual. "But with you, I feel different. I feel like I'm letting go of something I've held on to for years." Ella's mind raced as she tried to process his words. She had never expected him to be so open, so vulnerable. The Victor Romano she had known was a man of power, of control, someone who never showed weakness. But now, standing before her, he seemed human. And for the first time, Ella felt as though she could relate to him in a way she never had before. "I never wanted to feel this way," Victor said, his eyes softening. "But I can't ignore it anymore. I can't pretend that things haven't changed. I can't pretend that I haven't changed." Ella felt her heart swell in her chest, a mixture of confusion and something deeper that she couldn't name. She had always kept her distance, had always tried to protect herself from anything that could hurt her. But now, with Victor standing before her, speaking with such sincerity, she realized that she had let her guard down. She had let him in, and now she was unsure of what came next. "I don't know what to say," Ella whispered. "I never thought you would say something like this." Victor took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't need to say anything," he replied softly. "I just wanted you to know that I see you, Ella. I see you for who you are. And that means more to me than you know." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Ella's heart was racing, but she couldn't find the words to respond. She had never imagined that her relationship with Victor would evolve like this. She had always thought of him as someone unreachable, someone who could never see her as anything other than just another part of his empire. But now, in this moment, she realized how much he truly saw her, how much he appreciated her. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe it. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't just a maid. She was someone who mattered. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Victor nodded, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "Just know that things are different now, and I'm glad they are." Ella felt a sense of peace wash over her. She didn't know what the future held, but in this moment, she knew that whatever happened, she wasn't alone. She was seen, and that was enough.